So with the release of Strixhaven, I went ahead and I made, the budget decks that you guys have seen here on the channel, and I did get a few comments and questions about how to upgrade and go about upgrading the deck. So in today's video, we dive into those budget decks that I did create. Not all of them, but a few of them, and we're going to go over various upgrades to the decks that you can do to make them overall better. With that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to know post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive into the budget decks and let's talk about it. All right, so the first deck up on the list that I kind of went already over once in the budget form is Orzhov Warlocks. So a lot of the feedback I got from the budget version of the deck is that some of the cards were a little bit clunky, and it's one of those things that kind of happen when you are new to a set. You kind of overlook certain cards, and you kind of like don't really know how to put them just together just yet without really getting some playtesting. So I do apologize for that, but I did kind of create an Orzhov Warlock style deck. But I kind of put a little bit of my spin on it. I've added in some of the cards I've come to find out are actually pretty good with the new set Strixhaven, and kind of did my spin on that. Overall, the deck kind of looks and plays a little bit the same, but I think there is improvements to the deck overall that kind of make it that much better. We do have a learn board because we did keep some of the cards that help us learn and kind of go into our sideboard, as well as adding a couple more rares and mythics to the deck as a whole. With that being said, I mean, the deck, like I said, plays a little bit more on the aggressive side because we do play some of the cards that have come from like spells and the mono white spells deck that I did a budget on, but we also keep our the black part of it for a little bit of that black control. So with the deck overall, it's pretty straightforward on what we're doing here. Playing a few more spells to kind of get triggers of Magecraft, whereas we're playing some bigger top end heavier cards that kind of hit a little harder towards the end game / mid game. So starting off in the 1-drop slot, we actually added in Clever Lemonancer. To be quite honest, this card right off the bat was one of those cards I didn't realize to be as good as it was. But, playing a deck that's a little bit heavier on the spells and creatures, it's actually pretty good. The idea here, whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +2/+2 into end of turn. So an overall, a pretty decent and aggressive upgrade. You play this on turn 1, turn 2, if you play a spell, or even something like a Guiding Voice. You're going to swing in for some pretty chunky damage on turn 2, and it puts your opponent already in a position of possibly playing defensively. And the next card up is Guiding Voice. It puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and we get to learn, which we get to go to our learn board. Follow that up in the 2-drop slot. We actually add in Leonine Light Scribe. It's a 2-mana 2/2, and then whenever we cast instant or sorcery spell, we get to put a creatures we control get +1/+1 until end of turn, so it just makes our creatures that much more aggressive. Combine that with the Clever Luminancer, it just makes our deck overall that much more aggressive, which I think is actually pretty good, especially in a best-of-1 format. You want to be on the aggressive than be on the defensive most of the time, so this helps us be that little bit more aggressive. Next card up is Shale, Dean of Radiance, and also Embers, Dean of Shadow. This is actually another interesting one. Sure, we're not creating a lot of creatures per turn if we were playing more of that mono white style that has things that create tokens and things like that, but I mean we do like the Ember side of it, and we can always play the Shale side if we want to, but the Ember side is really what we're focusing on, as the fact that he can tap +1/+1 counter on target creature. It deals 2 damage to that creature, which isn't crazy. I mean, it is a little bit of a drawback, but if you actually think about it, if you actually put a +1/+1 counter on your opponent's creature and your opponent it has a weak like 1/1 or something like that, it actually is going to kill the creature in the process, which is kind of like a weird kind of like thing that you can do. But on top of it, he can whenever a creature we control +1/+1 counter on it dies, we get to actually draw a card, which is actually kind of like a good benefit, just because there's not too many ways without sacrificing a creature or paying life to really draw cards, and he actually has a pretty good effect there. And like I said, you could always play the Shale if you really need something out in the early game. It's just that we don't play a lot of creatures, so that tapping it for a +1/+1 counter on each creature that enter the battlefield this turn is not going to be 100% great, but it is a possibility if we really, really want to. Then we got Show of Confidence. This is actually another interesting card here. It kind of synergizes well with our creatures that have Magecraft, and the idea here is whenever we cast this spell, we may copy it for each other instant or sorcery spell we cast this turn, so it has like a little bit of that Storm ability. Then we can choose new targets for the copy, and essentially we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains Vigilance end of turn, so it allows us to attack him pretty aggressively, but leaving up blockers. And if we even cast it with like one other spell, we can get 3 copies of this, which is definitely pretty good there. And like I said, combine that with Magecraft, it makes our creatures that much more aggressive and just overall that much better. Then you got Humiliate, which is actually another very good card that I actually kind of overlooked when it came to my first pass run the gold color cards. But it essentially allows us for 2 mana to look at target opponent's hand, choose an online card from it, make them discard that card, and then we get to put +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. So for 2 mana, I mean, that's overall pretty good. We get to look at their hand, kind of get information, get a +1/+1 counter, be a little bit more aggressive. But just overall pretty solid card there. Then I have Vanish in the Verse. Only 2 copies of this just because it is a card that only exiles target monocolor permanent. But for 2 mana, I do think that's a pretty solid effect. There are a lot of decks that are in the format that are monocolored, and having a spell that only costs 2 mana to exile them is actually pretty solid. So just an overall pretty decent card in here. I wouldn't want to put too many copies in just because in case you get matched up against a deck that plays a lot of multicolor cards, kind of like our deck, you're not gonna have too many targets for this. But just an overall good card to just kind of have maybe a couple copies of for 2 mana in the deck. Then we got Mavinda, Students of the Advocate. Another good solid card here. Essentially allows us to target instant or sorcery for 0 from our graveyard this turn. If this spell doesn't target creature control, it costs 8 more to cast this way. Which we're not going to do anything that's going to be removal, but we can always get replay something like a Guided Voice, Show of Confidence, things like that. But essentially allows us to replay a spell again from our graveyard to just kind of, if we don't really have too much in the way of plays, we can always just redo a spell from our graveyard. But overall, pretty solid card, 2/3 flyer. I think this card is probably one of the better mythics, I think, from Strixhaven, and definitely pretty cool, and it helps synergizes us being aggressive, especially in that best of 1 meta. So this is a card that I'm actually interested in messing around with. I'm not 100% sure if I'm sold on it, but it's a 3 mana spell that has 2 different abilities. Target player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. For 3 mana, I think that's actually pretty good. Though it doesn't say, target creature or planeswalker, it's target player, so the player gets to make the choice. But I think that's a pretty decent for 3 mana. And then on top of it, we can, for 3 mana, get a 2/1 black inkling creature flying. So if we really need a blocker or something, we can always play an instant speed creature. But definitely pretty cool there. And for 3 mana, it's not too bad. So the next card we have is Extist, Auric Overlord. It's a 4 mana 2/4 Global Strike. Whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, return target non-legendary creature card from our graveyard to our hand. So this is kind of one of our good ways to kind of get stuff back from our graveyard in the later game if anything was killed off in the early game. It allows us to just kind of get things back and kind of, hopefully have more momentum if in case there's any sort of board wipe, as long as they weren't exiled. But definitely pretty good, and combine that with the amount of spells we play, I do think there's going to be a few things. And then on top of it, we have the 8 mana, 6 colorless, black and a red. Additional cost to cast a spell, you may sacrifice any number of creatures. The spell costs 2 less for each creature sacrificed this way. Then each opponent sacrifices a creature, create a 3/6 black and red avatar creature token with haste, and whenever this creature attacks, it deals 3 damage to each opponent, which is pretty good. It's kind of in a weird way you make your own Kroxa, but you don't make your opponent discard. But essentially, you get a Kroxa that essentially already deals 3 damage regardless if it actually hits your opponent, which is definitely pretty good in a way if you want to get that extra damage. It's definitely interesting on how to do that. And the only downfall is you do have to sacrifice creatures if you want to get it for cheaper, but it's kind of like a cool alternate play if you really want to go for it. I kept in 2 copies of Closing Statement, which I'm still not 100% sure if I'm sold on this card. It's a 5 mana removal at any time other than your end step because it costs 2 less, so it could be a 3 cost removal. But it destroys target creature or planeswalker we don't control, and we get to put a +1/+1 counter up to 1 target creature we control. So it's got some value. I'm unsure if this is something I want to keep in the deck or just kind of go with the typical staples when it comes to removal, like Heartless Act or Eliminate or something like that. But I still kept it in here just to keep this Strixhaven flavor to the deck overall, because I'm looking at the deck and I actually don't think we're really playing anything outside of Strixhaven that it's in the meat of the deck, to be quite honest. So it's definitely pretty good there. Then we get Shadrix, the Silver Quill, the dragon that came from Strixhaven. It's a 5 mana 2/5 double strike. Flyer. At the beginning of our combat, you may choose to. Each mode must target a different player. Essentially, we can target player creates a 2/1 white black inkling creature token with flying. Target player draws a card, loses a life, and target player puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature they control. So this is one of those other ones I'm unsure of, because I think when you do actually choose to actually use this effect, you actually have to choose both. You can't just choose one. So that's one of the downfalls. So it's one of those things. So if you want to put +1/+1 counters on your own creatures, you have to give your opponent either a 2/1 black inkling creature token with flying, or make them draw a card and lose a life. So it's got a little bit of a drawback, but it's something that I kind of want to mess with. It's interesting. I mean, if you give your opponent a 2/1 inkling, it may not be the worst of the worlds. You never want to give your opponent drawing a card or losing a life unless they're really close to death. But definitely an interesting card. We have 2 copies in the deck. Nothing too crazy, but definitely cool to use the new dragon for our Orzhov style deck. And then the last card in the deck is Professor Onyx, 6 mana, Planeswalker with Magecraft. Whenever we copy an instant or sorcery spell, each opponent loses 2 life and we gain 2 life. So definitely another good card that goes with Show of Confidence if we can get multiple copies of, because then every time that card copies itself, we're going to gain X amount of life and make our opponent lose X amount of life. For +1, we can look at we can lose 1 life, look at the top 3 cards of our library, put one of them to our hand, the rest into the graveyard, which is definitely pretty good. It's kind of like a draw effect, but we get to kind of pick what card we want. Each opponent sacrifices a creature for -3 with the greatest power among them that player controls. So definitely good there, though it doesnn't target a particular creature. Overall sacrificing is always good because it gets around indestructibility. And then for -8, if we get to this point, each opponent may discard a card. If they don't, they lose 3 life, and then we repeat this process 6 times. So essentially, her -8 is the finisher. Just because if they don't have any cards and they do this 6 times 7, if they do a total of 7 times, they're gonna lose 21 life just right there. Even if they do it like 5-6 times, they're gonna lose a good chunk of life. And if you haven't been attacking aggressively the whole game, I mean, they're pretty close to death at this point anyway. By the time you probably get to that -8 effect, definitely a good card. And we have 2 copies of it just because it is a little bit on the expensive side. And just overall, it's one of those interesting things to kind of see how the Planeswalkers plays out. I do think this is probably the better of the Planeswalkers in the set, but it's one of those things to kind of see how the set evolves and kind of see where things go. And then on top of it, just the mana base, I kind of tweaked it a little bit. I think we are now playing 26 lands in the deck. We got 5 plains, 4 swamps, 4 of the pathways, 4 of the snarls, 2 campuses, 1 triome, and 4 fabled passages. I'm probably gonna get rid of the campuses just because I just realized I probably didn't tweak them out, and I'm probably just adding a couple more basics just so we have a more likely chance of having our snarls come into play untapped. But overall, I mean, this is Orzhov Warlocks. I think this deck is definitely a lot better than the budget version of the deck that I originally created. It's definitely pretty cool in what it does, and I think it's a pretty unique way of combining Magecraft and kind of like a little bit of control in a way. So it's like a Orzhov aggro mid-range style deck. So definitely pretty cool. And if you guys have any feedback, let me always know. I always like to kind of hear what you guys think when it comes to creating these decks. And I guess I didn't really change too much in the way of the lesson board other than add in Academic Probation, which is a 2-mana card that allows us to name a non-land card. Opponents can cast spells with that until our next turn. So it kind of helps us slow down someone who may be playing something like the Sultai Ultimatum style deck. If they're going to play an Ultimatum or something, you can always make them not be able to play it. In the Necrotic Fumes, we have 1 copy of 2 Inkling Summons, and then Expanded Anatomy. Just because, adding +1/+1 counters and giving things vigilance is always very good, and it kind of synergizes well with other things like Magecraft, and getting this with +2/+1/+1 counters, getting it +2/+2. It starts to scale up, and giving it vigilance makes us be able to attack a little bit more aggressively. With that being said, let's move on to the next deck and let's talk about it. So this next deck is actually our Izzet Spells deck that I originally created. It's a little less on the way of aggressive and maybe a little bit more on the mid-range / control side of things, as I've kind of tweaked it and added in some more of the Strixhaven rares and mythics and whatnot. But overall, the deck hasn't changed too much drastically. It's still black, blue, and red. But like I said, we're playing more of that mid-range game. The early game is a lot of disruption to kind of slow down our opponent, and then once we get into the meat of our deck and get to what we're trying to do here, we're really trying to play these cards to kind of take the advantage against our opponent. But overall, the deck is playing 2 copies of Golgari Disruption just as a good way to slow down our opponent, especially if they want to cast spells aggressively, thinking that we may not have counters, or if our opponent starts to have a lot of mana where the spell doesn't actually fit as a good counter spell, we can always play it as a land tapped. 2 copies of Negate. Yet again, Sultai Ultimatum is a thing, and it's definitely a very big, hard-hitting spell, so 2 copies of Negate. Test of Talents is another card I'm interested in messing around with, just because it is counter-target instant or sorcery spell. We get to essentially search their graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with the same name as that spell and exile them. And then that player shuffles, then draws cards for each card exiled from their hand this way. So sometimes your opponent only has 1 copy, and if we counter like something like a Sultai Ultimatum or an Extinction Event or a sort of spell, they may only cast their only copy, and then allowing us to go through their library and graveyard to actually now exile them, and they can't actually reoccur them. I actually think this card is actually pretty good for a solid counter, just having this additional ability of us being able to exile it, for 2 mana, which is definitely very good. Then we got Blitz of the Thunder Raptors. It's a very solid card because we're playing a very spell-heavy style deck. It's damage that will do to our opponent's creatures will go up the more spells we have in our graveyard. So essentially, it deals damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to number of instant or sorcery cards in our graveyard. If the creature our planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. So for 2 mana, it starts off as a small burn damage, but then once you start getting to like the later game, we may have 5, 6, 7 instants and sorceries in our graveyard. This thing's gonna be like dealing 6, 7, 8 even more damage to our opponent, which is definitely very solid in that part. Also, pretty decent when you think about it. If our opponent's playing something like Rogues, where they're milling cards into our graveyard, this card's going to go up. Its burn damage is going to go up in value pretty quickly, especially if they're milling cards into our graveyard. Then we got Shatterskull Smash-In, just for the basis of if our opponent's playing, maybe a board that has a couple creatures that we just want to get rid of. You can always tap it for the X and 2 red, and deal X damage to them. And if we pay 6 or more, it deals double. And then we can always play it as a red mana source in case we don't really draw it, and we can pay 3 life to come into battlefield untapped. But just as a backup way, also getting some value out of our lands, which is always very good. Then we got 4 copies of Prismari Command. This is definitely a pretty interesting card here, just because sure it doesn't counter anything, but I do like the idea that it can deal 2 damage to any target. We can always discard 2 cards and draw 2 cards. And then we can create a treasure token, and we can destroy target artifacts. So it does a couple different things, and depending on the situation, we can always choose 2 of the best ones. And, definitely pretty solid card overall. Then we got Torrent of the Sculptor and Flamethrower Sonata. The Sculptor is probably the one card that actually fits very well in this deck, just essentially here. It's a 2/2 for 4 mana with Ward 2. So essentially, if our opponent doesn't pay the 2 mana, if they target it, the spell or ability gets countered. And then when it enters the battlefield, we get to exile a target instant or sorcery card from the graveyard, put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to half the card's mana value rounded up. So a lot of our cards in our top end are things we can discard for 2 mana to create a treasure. We can always exile them and make this thing like a 6/6 when it comes out on turn 4, which is definitely pretty beefy. And with Ward and also +1/+1 counters, it actually makes it very hard for this thing to get removed other than like a global effect, like a board wipe. And then the other side, we have Flamethrower Sonata. It's a 2 mana sorcery, discard a card, draw a card. Then when you discard an instant or sorcery card this way, it deals damage equal to that card's mana value to target creature or planeswalker. So just like another way, it's another like blitz of the Thunder Raptor, but not at instant speed. So definitely a good backup way. Kind of also like the Narset Jeskai Planeswalker as well. But unfortunately, we have to discard a card first and then draw a card. But it's just one of those other benefits, for 2 mana, just in case we need some sort of removal. Another card I wanted to mess around with, I did see it in CGB's video today, and it actually kind of seemed pretty interesting to play with it in the deck. But it is Ifrit Flame Painter. It's a 4 mana 1/4 double striker. When it deals combat damage to a player, you may cast instant or sorcery card from a graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that spell would be put into our graveyard, exile instead. So essentially, if it deals damage, it actually will do damage twice. So essentially, we'll get 2 spells from our graveyard as long as it doesn't get blocked, which is pretty good. And we can recur some of our bigger spells, or the thing is they have a discard effect to get a treasure token, and maybe our opponent will not block it because they don't see anything that big and aggressive in our deck, so we just maybe discard it after they don't block, and then all of a sudden, we get 2 big effects out of it. And we got Trishonic Intervention. It's another interesting card here that kind of fits well with our deck just because we play a lot of big top end things. But as additional cost to cast this spell, exile instant or sorcery card from a graveyard. It deals X damage to each non-dragon creature, where X is the exiled card's mana value. If a creature would damage this way, exile instead, and then we have to exile this card. But I mean, for the idea of what this card does and what our deck is consisted of, it's definitely a good way to remove a pretty beefy board, because a lot of our top end cards are 6, 7, 8 mana. So we can, depending on the situation, we can pretty much essentially deal 8 damage to something that's not a dragon. So that's definitely pretty cool. I kept in the 3 copies of the Experimental Overlord. It's definitely an interesting card here. On the idea that it's another card that benefits us from stacking up a lot of instants and sorceries in our graveyard. And then we essentially get this weird token based on the number of instants and sorceries. And then we can return an instant or sorcery card from our graveyard to our hand. And then we exile Experimental Overlord. So a lot of things that will, get a big creature, get a big spell back from our graveyard to our hand. And then, definitely pretty good value there. Then we got Galzith Prismari. It's a 4 mana 3/4 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, create a treasure token. Artifacts we control have tap, add 1 mana of any color, spend this mana only to cast instant or sorcery spells. So essentially here, our treasure tokens then, from going from tap to sacrifice, add 1 mana of any color. We can actually just tap them now to play our instants and sorceries in our library without sacrificing them. So definitely pretty solid there. So definitely cool in that effect. And then combine that with Goldspan Dragon, which essentially turns our treasure tokens that we're now creating in the deck essentially allowing them to get 2 mana of any color, and this has flying and haste for 5 mana. And whenever it attacks or gets targeted by a spell, we also create treasure tokens. Just, a couple synergies here with our treasure tokens just to kind of get the best value out of them, the most bang for the buck. And then at the top end here, we have, we have 2 copies of Seagate Restoration, just in case we want to draw really big if we have a big full hand. We have 2 copies of Creative Outburst. It's a big spell here. It deals 5 damage to any target. Look, top 5 cards of our library. You get to put one of them to our hand, the rest in the bottom of our library in any order. And like I was saying before, it has the tap 2, discard it, and create a treasure token. And then the last card here is Magma Opus. It's a 8 mana spell. It deals 4 damage divided among as we choose it among any number of targets. So we can choose their creatures and their face. And then we get to tap 2 target permanents, and we create a 4/4 red-blue elemental creature token, and we draw 2 cards. And like I said before, we get to tap 2, and we create a treasure token. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. We're playing 5 islands, 9 mountains, 4 of the snarls, and 4 of the pathways. Essentially, this deck is pretty solid round and round. We have some things to disrupt the early game on our opponent, and then if we can get to that mid-game to late game, we are going to hopefully take over at that point just because we have a lot of big top-end things. The one thing I would say that I'm kind of thinking about maybe tweaking before I actually upload this onto my Aetherhub link is maybe just tweaking the amount of these 2 top-end things, because I feel like these are cards that we definitely want to hit. So maybe add in maybe 1 more copy of each. It'd be pretty good. But overall, like I said, this is something you can always mess around with. You can always try if you want to add in more copies or take less copies of things. Let me know down in the comments below. But let's move on to the next deck and let's talk about it. So this next deck up is a deck that you guys probably have already seen. And this is actually like one of the decks that you guys were really looking for some sort of way to upgrade or to make better. And that is actually the Fractals deck. The one thing I will say, the deck kind of isn't as heavy on Fractals as it was in the budget version, just because I kind of did focus on that. But in doing so, I actually kind of found some cards I think synergize very well with our +1/+1 counters and also our tokens. That definitely help us out and give us a little bit more of an advantage, a little bit more of value out of our cards. So the first card I would actually say that's actually pretty good, that helps us, that fits in this style, is actually Vorinclex. Just in the fact that whenever a permanent we put 1 or more counters on a permanent or a player, put twice that many counters on each of those onto that permanent or player instead. So essentially, when our Fractals come into the battlefield, essentially just doubles the counters that they'll be getting, so we can always play any of our Fractal spells, and then we'll get double the counters. And if our opponent's playing any sort of counters, whether it's Planeswalkers, Sagas, anything like that, they actually get half those counters, so it doesn't trigger Sagas. Sagas won't go to the next chapter. But overall, pretty solid card that just helps us double up. The only other thing I was thinking of was the green-white guy from M21 that essentially allows us to get additional +1/+1 counter whenever we put a +1/+1 counter on something. But I thought Vorinclex is probably better, and then I didn't have to add in white mana to make it work in the deck. Another card that I actually added in that's from Kaldheim is actually Eska's Chariot. It's a 4 mana 4/4 legendary artifact vehicle. It enters the battlefield. We get to create 2 cat creature tokens, and then whenever it attacks, we get to create a token that's a copy of target token we control. So essentially, all our fractal tokens will now, we'll get an additional fractal token, or we'll get an additional fractal creature, which is essentially a copy of our another fractal creature. So definitely cool there. And the fact that, it creates some additional tokens, creates some more additional pressure, which always is a good thing. And then, of course, the last thing I added in that kind of like, I think this deck kind of turns into like a mid-range aggro style deck. I added an All-Runs Epiphany just as an interesting way to kind of take some additional turns, as sometimes because the deck is a lot of sorcery cards that produce fractals is a little bit on the slower end. I just figured giving us like an extra turn when we get to like turn 5 or 6, depending how our mana ramp is, we can always just take an extra turn, just kind of maybe attack that much more aggressively against our opponent, having them to be on the defensive. Because if we can get to like kind of this top end of the end game here, we can kind of start creating these big fractal creature tokens, which will definitely overwhelm our opponent. But overall, other than that, the deck is pretty straightforward. We added in 4 copies of Swarm Shambler, just because it enters battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, which is definitely good. And whenever a creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it becomes target of a spell or opponent controls, we get a 1/1 green insect creature token. So definitely pretty good there if our opponent decides to use some sort of removal against any of our creature tokens. At least get a token out of it, and then we can always tap it and put a +1/+1 counter on it to make it bigger. So definitely something that has some good value there. It kind of protects our fractals a little bit in that way. Add in some Droid disruptions just because, yet again, Sultai Ultimatum is a thing, so add in some more disruptions to possibly slow them down from casting it is always very good. Worst case scenario, always played as the tap land on the other side if our opponent has a lot of mana and they're just casting spells, and they can definitely pay the 1 cost of, unless they pay the 1. 2 emergent sequences, just because it's a decent way to kind of ramp up into our library to get more additional lands on the battlefield. The one downfall is we do actually have to make the creature a land, the land a creature, so it can be targeted. But you know, it essentially gets a +1/+1 counter for each land that enters the battlefield under our control. So we do play some Evolving Wilds and Fable Passages. So if we can sacrifice this, play this, sacrifice this, get an additional land, play this, the creature can become like a 4/4, or a 3/3. I can't do the math in my head. So play the land, get a land, get the land from this. Okay, maybe it's a 3/3. So not too bad there. Decisive Denial is definitely another good card in the deck. It's another way for us to slow down our opponent from playing something like their Sultai Ultimatum or their big spell. And then on top of it, we can always use it to fight target creature we don't control once we start getting some big fractals out, which is always very good. We have Fractal Summons in the main board. I don't think I have too many cards that really learn, so I added in the main board. Though we do have cards in the learn board in case we do have cards, if you want to put in cards that have learn. I added in some solid commons, just some as overall counter spells. You can always foretell it, and then when we need it in the later game, we can always pay 2 mana instead of putting in the 3 mana. You know, you can always swap in some other things. You want some Essence Scatters, you want some cancels, you want some of the new counters. You know, it's up to you really what you want to do. I just figured we just have a counter spell that kind of counters any spell. Then we have Cayenne, Dean of Substance, and Imbrum, Dean of Theory. They're both pretty solid. One is a 2/2 for 3 mana. Exile top card of our library. If it's a land card, we get to put it to our hand. So kind of like a way to kind of draw a card if we draw a land. Otherwise, we put a study counter on it. For 5 mana, we can create a 0/0 green-blue fractal creature token with a +1/+1 counter for each different mana value among non-land cards we own with a study counter on them, which is definitely pretty good in that sense. So in the later game, if we have her out, we can start exiling top cards of our library at the end of our turn, or during our turn, or during our opponent's turn, whenever we feel like tapping her. And then essentially we can pay 5 mana, we'll start producing some decent fractals. They have Imbram, Dean of Theory, which he's a 3/3 for 4 mana. A flying for, you know, X and 2 blue. You exile top X cards of our library, put a study counter on each of them. Then you may put a card you own from exile with a study counter on them into your hand. So in a weird way, you can kind of do what Cayenne does, but essentially now you get to, you know, if you tap 3, so you tap 5 mana total. You exile 3 cards. You can choose one of them to put in your hand to keep the other 2 in your exile. And then, you know, every time you do this, you can always look back and kind of depend on the situation. You can always pull something from that exile area that has study counters on them and bring them to your hand. So definitely interesting there. And if you probably get both of them out on the battlefield, you can definitely take decent advantage of both effects and, you know, start ramping up a lot of cards into your exile with study counters, and then eventually start pumping out some fractals, depending on how many cards you have with study counters on them. Then you get Kasmina, Enigma Sage. Yet again, another Planeswalker, 3 mana, which is definitely very good. Definitely good value for a cheap Planeswalker. Her first ability is +1 Scry, or +2 Scry 1, which is always very good to kind of find the answer. -X, we can create a 0/0 green-blue fractal creature token with X +1/+1 counters on it. Definitely good as well once we start going up there. Then -8, we get to search our library for an instant or sorcery card that shares a color with this Planeswalker. Exile that card. Then shuffle. You may cast this card without paying its mana cost. So definitely very good. You can always get one of your big top end spells, something like, you know, All-Run Epiphany or something like that. You know, depending on the situation, you can always read what you need and kind of always get that card. It's definitely good there. And then if we actually had other Planeswalkers, which unfortunately there really isn't much that kind of fits in what we're trying to do here. I mean, I think there's the Planeswalker. Like I said, I'm thinking about it. I really can't think. Maybe there's Jace from Zendikar Rising that we could use, but it's definitely tough to find another Planeswalker that synergizes well with this deck. But definitely interesting ability that she gives a global effect to other Planeswalkers. So maybe in some sort of like deck that you play X Planeswalkers, or you can figure out how to play X Planeswalkers, she could be good there. And then we move on to the next card, which is Quandrix Command. It's a 3 mana instance card. We get to return target creature or Planeswalker to its owner's hand, so we'll bounce effect depending on the situation, whether it's our opponent's creatures or our creatures. We get to target artifact or enchantment spell, so definitely some sort of way to slow down our opponent, especially if they're playing something like mono red. We can always counter their Ember Cleave, their Annex, because that actually targets both. Same thing for mono white. You can always get rid of their All Seeds or maybe their Skyclave. And then you can always choose put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, which is also very good. And then depending on the situation, you can always choose the last one, which is target player shuffles up to 3 cards from the graveyard into their library. So if you got 3 key cards that you may have casted already, you can always shuffle them back in to replay them later in the game if you draw them. Then you have Serpentine Curve. Yet again, another card that takes advantage of us playing a lot of instants and sorceries. Because we create a 0/0 green-blue fractal creature token where X is +1/+1 counters on it, where X is 1 plus the total number of instant sorcery cards we own in exile and in our graveyard. So definitely interesting there. It actually takes advantage of us if we have any instance of sorceries in our exile from these cards, as well as I think technically the Foretell also counts as exile, so this card actually will count that as well in it, which is definitely pretty cool. So if you cast turn 4 but have this, from the earlier game, you'll actually get that additional X, which is definitely good there. Like I said before, Izzet Chariot makes the deck. It's a 4-mana 4/4, creates 2 cat tokens, and then whenever it attacks, we get to create a copy of target creature we control. So the idea here is you want to copy your Fractals. Worst case scenario, you just copy additional cats, so you can always attack with Izzet Chariot. Then we got Tanzer Quandrix. It's the dragon for Simic. It's fly and trample. Enters the battlefield, we double the number of +1/+1 counters and target creature control, and then whenever it attacks, you may have base power and toughness of other creatures you control become equal to Tanzar's power and toughness at the end of turn. So essentially here is you attack in with him and maybe some of your Fractals. Your Fractals go from 0/0 tokens before the +1/+1 counters up to a 4/4, and then they get the additional +1/+1 counters from how many counters they have on them, so they become very large Fractals that your opponent has to really deal with, or they're going to get overwhelmed. Definitely pretty interesting there. On top of it, if you have something like this out and you already have Vorinclex out, you can actually essentially double the double. Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, you would, if you're going to if let's just say you have a 5/5 Fractal, you're going to double those counters, but Vorinclex is out. I think that essentially then it's additional 5 counters on it, so then it gives it a +10/+10, so it becomes a 15/15. If I'm not mistaken, I think that's how it works out. I haven't actually had that situation, but it's definitely an interesting synergy kind of there. Then we got the Leyline Invocation. Yet again, another big top end card that creates a big fractal based on how many lands we control. Definitely cool there. Yeah, Vorinclex, which also makes the cut just because it helps our +1/+1 counters on a lot of our fractal creatures. If we draw this, and then it just makes those cards that much better. Allrun's Epiphany, just a good way to take an extra turn. Yet again, we can foretell this in the early game. Helps us with Serpentine Curve. And then we get an extra turn in the later game and some bird tokens out of it, which is always very good, especially if we start having some big fractals out on the board. Allows us to overwhelm our opponent. Seagate Restoration, for the idea here, if we want to draw a big amount of cards in the late game or in the early game, we can always play it if we really need a blue mana source by paying 3 life or having to come to the battlefield tapped. And then the last cards, other than that, I mean, the rest of the deck is just full of lands. I think we are playing... Seemed like a lot. I feel like I had more lands. But essentially here we're playing three islands, 8 forests, 4 of the pathways, 2 of the snarls, 2 Evolving Wilds, and 4 Fabled Passages here. I kind of, the deck has some of the tap lands in it from, Zendikar Horizon, and I didn't want to put too many copies of the snarls just because I think we do play a lot more green than blue. Though looking at it, there's maybe an idea that you may want some more blue sources. Maybe get rid of the Evolving Wilds if you don't think that this is going to be there. But it's kind of one of those things if you really want to. And like I said, we have some stuff in the wish board, but we don't have anything in the deck that learns. So the learn board is really not going to be used. So I would disregard that if you're actually building the deck for the first time. But definitely overall interesting deck. When it works pretty well. I do think this version is definitely much better just because it has a lot more things that synergize very well from other sets that kind of help, our things become that much stronger. But moving on to the last deck, let's talk about the last deck that we actually created. All right, so this last deck is the Witherbloom deck, which is, in my opinion, one of my more favorite decks just because I like having stacks of triggers going off against our opponent. Essentially here, we actually didn't do anything too crazy from the deck. I don't think the deck really increases too much in the way of rarities. I think the only thing that I really added in here that are rares that I didn't have in here previously was Lovestruck Beast. I added in some more copies of copies of Woestrider. Up to 4 copies of Sedgemoor Witch, and I think I just added 1 more copy of the Valentine, Dina the Vein, and Set Dina the Root. But other than that, the deck kind of stayed the same. We have the Eye Twitch here in the 1-drop slot to be an aggressive flyer. That when it dies, we learn, so definitely are going to utilize the learn board over here. You have Valentine, Dina of the Vein, and Lisette, Dina the Root. The first one is a 1/1 Menace Lifelinker. If a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile instead. When you do, you may pay 2. If we do, create a 1/1 black-green pest creature token. So essentially a good way to generate tokens if our opponent has things that end up in the graveyard. If by us paying 2 mana. And then in the later game, we can always play the Dina the Root. By whenever we gain life, we may pay 1 if we do get a +1/+1 counter each creature control, and those creatures gain trample in a turn. So this is actually very interesting here. So we really get the Witherbloom combo kind of going in a way. If we have the open mana, we can essentially sacrifice X amount of creatures with like Plum or something like that, and then if we have the open mana afterwards, we can actually tap how many copies based on that, and then we can essentially make whatever creatures that are on the battlefield that much stronger, and then give them all trample, which is definitely pretty cool as well. We have 4 copies of Village Rites, just because, yet again, a good sacrifice fodder. Draw 2 cards out of it. 1 mana instant speed is definitely good there. Hunt for Specimens, yet again, another sorcery card. That yet again is pretty good. It helps us, just create pests. It also helps us learn, so definitely having additional learn sources is always very good. Plum of the Forbidden. This is kind of like one of the key cards that helps us really go off with the deck once we have our Witherbloom Apprentice, our Sagemore Witch. Those are the key cards that helps us just kind of take that much more damage to our opponent. We can sacrifice our pests, our creatures that we don't really need, and then make copies of that for each sacrifice creature, and we draw a card and lose 1 life. So it just helps us dig a little bit deeper to get those creatures out on the battlefield. We got Tend to Pest, which is another interesting card here. It's as additional cost to cast a spell, sacrifice a creature, and we create an X/1/1 black-green pest creature token. With X creature dies, you gain X life, and then we gain we create, depending on what the power of the creature, we create X pest token creatures based on that. So if we want to sacrifice our Love Strike piece, maybe our tokens have died and we just need some more pest tokens, we can sacrifice this, get 5 tokens out of it. Definitely good there. And then, like I said before, with the Apprentice, it's kind of like the key cards that helps us kind of just ping down our opponent's life total. As Magecraft, whenever we cast our copy and instant or sorcery, each opponent loses 1 life, gains 1 life. Works very well with the Plum of the Forbidden. Bastion of Remembrance. This is another key card that helps us just ping our opponent down and help us gain some life. We get a 1/1 human soldier creature token out of it, which is also very good. Just a good way, just to give us additional ways to just help ping our opponent's life totals down pretty good. Sagemore Witch, yet again, Menace, 3/2 for 3 mana, has ward, pay 3 life, so your opponent wants to target it, they have to pay their own life total, which, depending on when we get her out and what their life total is, they may not be able to. And then whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we create a 1/1 black-green pest creature token. When the creature dies, we gain 1 life. So essentially, she's our way to kind of replenish our board with more pests if we play something like a Plum and we sacrifice all our pests in the process. And then we have War Strider in here, just another way to sacrifice something, maybe to Scry, which is always very good. It creates a goat token, and then it also has Escape, so it helps us against maybe that rogue matchup by tapping 5 mana, exiling 4 cards from our graveyard. It escapes the 2+1/+1 counters on it, so it becomes out bigger. Just a good way to have some more ways to sacrifice, maybe just dig a little bit deeper into an answer or something like that, or just kind of start getting some stuff going. And then, of course, we got Love Strike Beast, which synergizes very well with our Magecraft on our Sagemore Witch. For 3 mana, 5/5. For 1 mana, we can get a 1/1 human creature token. And it can't attack unless we control a 1/1 creature. Our deck creates a bunch of pests that are 1/1, so definitely good. It'll have a good way of getting in for some damage, which is definitely very good. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. 7 swamps, 6 forests, 4 pathways, 3 of the Snarls, and 4 copies of Fabled Passage. Wishboard hasn't changed too much. Necrotic Fumes, we got Containment Breach, 4 copies of Pest Summoning as a key card to help us just keep pests out on the battlefield, and then 1 Introduction to Annihilation. I don't think I actually thought about upgrading the learn board when I actually was doing there, so I just want to make sure I didn't forget anything. Let's look for a lesson that fits in our color source. I mean, that's a possibility, but I don't really know if that's something that's going to be that needed. Yeah, I mean, other than that, there's really not too much in the way of anything that I would really add or drop from the deck in the learn board that you probably don't already have. I mean, if you want, you can always add in 1 more copy of Necrotic Fumes if I don't want to add it there. You add it into here and maybe get rid of the Introduction to Annihilation. Just allows us to have 2 ways to exile target creature or planeswalker. Maybe that's just in the way or being very annoying to what we're trying to do. Other than that, I mean, that's the deck. And that wraps up the video, guys. I mean, those are all the budget decks that I went ahead and upgraded that I originally created. These aren't all of them, as there are a few more, as you can kind of see here, that are behind me that I'm in the process of also working on, tweaking and upgrading. Let me know which ones you maybe want to see get some upgrades to. Let me know your thoughts about each of these decks, depending on which ones you decide to go after and possibly make. With that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, when I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.